We had an idea that we really wanted to do something to support visual artists making new ideas in historic spaces. So I came to speak with Emma Thomas at Seaton Delaval Hall, and we developed this idea to shortlist 8 emerging artists each year and mentor and support them to produce new ideas.
Seaton Delaval Hall's history is very much as a place of drama, a place of theatre. The Delaval family, who became known as the Gay Delavals, were also known as benefactors, as patrons of the arts, as well as being interested in painting and interested in theatre themselves. So there's a strong history at Seaton Delaval Hall for working with artists and being involved with different art forms. So I think for us, the North East Emerging Artists Award is part of that long history.
The focus for this project is people who really are early career. They might have just come out of art school, or they might have just left a job and started a creative career. So this is aimed at them, and it's aimed at giving them some mentoring, support and a structure really, where they can take a small idea and expand it and grow it and deliver it at a larger scale at Seaton Delaval Hall.
I made a film that is exploring the different parts of the hall's past and all the transformations that it has contained over the centuries. So I've been exploring the family of the Delavals and their period living in the house and the destruction of the fire where the roof burnt down and what happened when the nature came back and re-inhabited the hall, and the bats that then came to live in the hall after that, all the way up to the National Trust coming to the building.
I'm currently undertaking a PhD, and it's called Design Through Play, and I'm looking at the whole idea of engaging people, particularly young people and children, in art and design. The idea was to look at the architecture and the architect and the whole idea of what was trying to be achieved on the site, and engage the public in a playful way to understand the entire Delaval estate.
So the work we've done is around decolonising in some small way the hall. So we have a series of photographs and an audio piece. I made the audio piece, and Dami here did the photography under, I guess, my instruction.
I just wanted to kind of capture the essence of each individual person, so kind of the locations matched the person and who they were and who we've gotten to know them as. And I think when we were taking the photos during that day, it just felt, moment after moment, just kind of heartwarming and wholesome. It was just like an amazing opportunity, I think, to be able to show our faces and taking up space across the beautiful landscape that it is, but also knowing that when you see so many black and brown faces like today, and hopefully they'll continue, it's kind of like this is what we've created and this was the goal.
They have to learn about the parameters of working with a historic building, because we have to be very careful with the fabric of the building, make sure we don't harm anything or impact on any of the surfaces. So there's a lot of support that comes as well from the staff in terms of how you work in a historic property.
It was a really wonderful learning experience to kind of organise, direct, perform in and co-edit this piece. That was really a first experience for me to make a work that isn't live. So that was really wonderful, and I was really happy to have that space and to have the resources to pull that together.
What I thought was really nice is that you at the hall and Matthew let us be individual on it. There was not so much input, so it meant that we could have an actual authentic piece of work that didn't feel like we had eyes on us.
In our first year we worked with photography, we worked with sound, worked with architecture, and we worked with dance. So I think for visitors coming to the hall, they got to experience a whole range of different approaches, and I think contemporary arts practice really contains all those different ways of working. It's not just painting and sculpture, it's artists working with all sorts of materials. And I think that's the really wonderful thing about Seaton Delaval Hall. It's a great canvas for presenting that sort of contemporary work in a historic setting.
The 70 pewter bats represent the amount of bats that have been found nesting in the walls of Seaton Delaval Hall, which is the largest winter roost of pipistrelle bats in the UK. But each bat began as a 3D scan, So it's like it's life size to an actual pipistrelle, and then that's been made into a silicon mold and then cast of recycled pewter, which is made up of disused UK manufactured tableware. It's been really nice to create like a work on a large scale, but also on a small scale where each of these bats are cast in my kitchen and polished by hand, and kind of like did it all without workshop access really.
They are wall hangings or textile quilts made entirely from 100% recycled or upcycled end-of-life fabrics. The one that I'm standing in front of is very much about the volunteers, and it's thinking about the grounds and the people that cultivate it and keep it looking as beautiful as it does. The one in the middle is more about the people that visit. It's made predominantly out of the lost property materials that I was given. That one's entirely handmade. And then the one at the end is more relating to National Trust as a whole. The background shapes are a blown up version of the National Trust logo. The screen print on top of that quilt is a reinterpretation of a pattern found on Cardinal Wolsey's purse, which is part of the archival collection here.
I've already written a piece about Seaton Delaval Hall already for a different project, and that was great. I got to look into the history of the place, but I kind of thought, well, I've done that already. I can't write another piece about the history. So let me think about Seaton Delaval Hall in the future. What's it going to be like in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000, 10,000?
See, normal procedure goes, you get one of my special post-it notes. Then you write down an impossible question on it and post it to me. Then I get cracking inventing an impossible invention to answer your impossible question.
So it's a bit sci-fi-esque in the thinking, but it's just having sort of play in what sort of will remain and getting people also to share their hopes of what they hope will remain too.
And that was the futures. I'll take those off of you. What did you think? Just one impossible machine's impossible idea of the future.
From a visitor perspective, I'm guessing that a lot of our visitors are coming for a great family day out, and some of them aren't expecting to see these contemporary art installations. But I think we've been really delighted on how visitors have engaged with the process. One of the great things that the project enables is that people can look at the 8 proposals and they can actually vote for their favourite. And we've seen lots of examples of couples and families having real interesting debates about their favourite proposals before they cast their vote. So that process is a really engaging one, so that everybody gets a say in which 3 proposals are selected each year.
Last year, about 70% of the people who came on site voted as part of the North East Emerging Artists Award, which is a fantastic result. People coming in and finding out about the artist proposals and then hopefully coming back and seeing the finished artworks.
It feels like a foot into the professional art world, which is something I was feeling quite alien in, to be honest, when I left art school. But after completing this project, it's oh, this is something that's not out of reach and something I can achieve.